The oil lasted 8 days, which was a miracle, and then, well, then the story's really over, and then we eat our latkes, which are really delicious. But why do we end the story there? The Maccabees became the Hasmonean dynasty, the last experiment in Jewish sovereignty before our own time. It was a very troubled experience. That's one of the reasons the rabbis of the Talmud didn't like Hanukkah very much, because they knew what the Hasmonean dynasty had become. But we don't talk about that, I believe, for the same reason we don't talk about the internal threats to Israel's democratic future, because we don't talk about the responsibilities of Jewish power. And it is this failure to talk about Jewish power, to engage with what our own tradition has to say about what comes after victimhood and survival, that I think helps to explain why so many young American Jewish kids feel so disengaged. It's because those kids, more than their parents and grandparents, are growing up with power and privilege in the United States. And they're seeing Israel as a regional superpower in the Middle East. And so it is precisely what our tradition has to say about Jewish power that could be most relevant to them, if we ever talked about it. I think we should tell young American Jews that as the generation growing up in an age of unprecedented Jewish power, they have been tasked by Jewish history with a very special obligation. During our long night of powerlessness, Jews spun visions of dignity and justice that inspired the world. But only now, in this age, can we learn the true meaning of those ethical visions. Because if the Jewish tradition of justice forged in powerlessness cannot survive the confrontation with Jewish power, if it cannot inform the actions of a Jewish state, then, in retrospect, what good was it? We need to tell young American Jews that this Jewish state is their birthright, their patrimony. It was won at a cost in blood and suffering that they can scarcely even imagine. And it was not born to be another Hasmonean dynasty. It was born to live the Enlightenment ideals that Europe had betrayed. We should tell young American Jews that if that kind of Jewish state dies, it will be a stain upon their lives. That Israel's collapse as a democratic project will have as profound an impact on their experience as Jews as Israel's creation had for their parents and grandparents. We should tell them that in the 1960s, the best of their parents' generation could have been found in places like Alabama and Mississippi, when American democracy was in its moment of crucible, and that they need to find a way of being involved in the struggle for Israeli democracy. Because although Israel may not be their country, the Jewish people are their people, and their fate is thus intertwined with that small nation half a world away. But people sometimes ask me about the conversations I have these days with folks like my cousin David, who aren't very happy about my book. But in truth, those aren't really the conversations that I worry about. The conversations I worry about are the ones I'll have one day with my 6-year-old son and my 4-year-old daughter if we, on our watch, let the dream of a democratic Jewish state die. I don't want to have those conversations. I want Ezra and Naomi to one day put up the flag of a democratic Jewish state in their own children's rooms, and that is far more important to me than the difficult conversations I might have to have with family or friends at this moment. That's why I wrote this book, and I'm very, very glad to you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I want to just remind everyone, because we forgot to turn off cell phones. We've had a few mishaps, and it just interrupts the flow. So take a second to do that. And let the grilling begin. I want to start with your point about Jewish victimhood, which you talk about in the book. You have a quote that says, "In their effort to inoculate Israeli policy from criticism, American Jewish organizations have stretched anti-Semitism's definition to the point of absurdity." Can you talk about a little bit more specifically how you mean that?
Yes. For me, anti-Semitism to have meaning has to mean animus towards Jews. Harsh criticism of Israel does not reflect necessarily animus towards Jews. Even stupid criticism, harsh, stupid criticism of Israel does not necessarily, even harsh, stupid, and incorrect criticism of Israel does not necessarily mean you are anti-Semitic unless you can point to some larger pattern in which people have expressed animosity towards Jews. And I think what's happened is, the truth of the matter is, that anti-Semitism in the United States has declined quite dramatically in the last 50 or 60 years. There's actually a lot of good data on this now. There's a recent book by Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist, which actually shows that Jews are the most highly thought of religious group in the United States. And Putnam actually has a fascinating theory, essentially, for how anti-Semitism essentially really dramatically diminished in the United States. It goes something like this. There was a fair amount of casual social anti-Semitism in the United States in the until the middle of the 20th century. Then this kind of casual social anti-Semitism got a bad name during World War II because we were fighting a war against the biggest anti-Semite in the history of the world. And so all of a sudden, to be anti-Semitic started to become a little bit anti-American in a way it did not. Putnam argues that that generation did not lose its anti-Semitism, but because it became publicly less acceptable, they didn't pass it down to their children. The transmission of that anti-Semitism was essentially stopped in those post-war decades by and large. And then, starting in the 1960s and 70s, you have an environment in which Jews essentially, virtually every institution in American life becomes wide open to Jews. There are today 3 Jews on the Supreme Court and no Protestants. There are presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton in recent years have all been Jewish. These are institutions that are not that long ago, within the lives of probably some of the people in this room, had quotas on the number of Jews. 4 of the 6 most recent editors of the New York Times have been Jewish. There has been a revolution in the status of Jews in the United States, even in Europe, where there is still more anti-Semitism, and where there is particularly some, I think, hostility to Jews in the Muslim immigrant population. You have a former president of France who proudly proclaimed his Jewish ancestry, who chose a Jewish foreign minister, and the current leader of the Labour Party in Britain is Jewish. So the suggestion that there is anti-Semitism today which is similar to the anti-Semitism of 75 years ago just seems to me to be nuts. What you find a lot with American Jewish leaders is they say the evidence of the anti-Semitism is that Israel is treated by a double standard. The problem, however, is that it's not, there are other ways of explaining why Israel may face a double standard. First of all, what you mean by a double standard is not always as simple as what people say. People say Israel receives more criticism than other countries. Well, it's true. Israel receives a lot of criticism in certain circles. But if you want to consider Israel in a regional context, in terms of how badly Israel is treated by the United States, it's worth remembering, if you look at the Middle East, that there are 2 countries in the greater Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, whose governments we militarily overthrew, 2 others, Syria and Iran, where we're contemplating military action, and several others, Somalia, Sudan, Pakistan, Yemen, where we regularly send drones to shoot at people. So the harsh criticism that Israel sometimes gets needs to be put in that context. Israel is our largest recipient of foreign aid. The other reason I think that I try to suggest that helps to explain why there is sometimes disproportionate criticism of Israel, and there is sometimes disproportionate criticism of Israel, especially on the left, is that I think Israel gets disproportionate criticism on the left, not because it's a Jewish state, but because it is a Western state. Which is to say, people in Europe and the developing world are inclined to see anything that they believe smacks of imperialism as the greatest crime, right? That's why they tend to be more exercised often about the things that the IMF or the World Bank does than what North Korea does. It's why they're more upset about American foreign policy than all the terrible things that post-colonial governments do in their own backyard. It's why they were more concerned about South Africa than many of the other African governments, which were actually abusing human rights at least as badly as West South Africa. Israel gets disproportionate criticism because it is seen as a Western imperial venture, and on the left, often, people consider that to be the original sin of modern times. I happen to believe that seeing Israel as an imperial or colonial project really misunderstands a lot of what Zionism is about. Yes, it's true that a lot of Jews came from Europe, but close to half of Israel's population actually are people like my own mother's family who have roots themselves in the Middle East. And when Zionists came to Israel, it was not the equivalent of the British going to Kenya. This was a 2,000-year-old tradition of deep connection to this land, which I think is part of why the global left sometimes gets Israel wrong. But that is different than saying it is overwhelmingly anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism directed against Israel and Jews, but I think to see the criticism of Israel as primarily stemming from anti-Semitism really misunderstands it.
But you talked, is this working, everyone? Yeah. You spoke in your book also about how it was clearly used as a way to keep Jews connected, almost as an identity card, and or a tug on conscience for Jews who otherwise weren't necessarily religiously inspired. Don't forget,
yes.
Israel is the refuge.
Yes. Yes.
We need it for that. And
yes.
I would say that that's what I think you've been criticizing, even I'm a little uncomfortable, is that when you start to say that anti-Semitism or the idea that we are still that population that is so fragile is almost used as a kind of a political, cudgel or strategy.
Yeah.
I see it, but we also, many of us still feel that way. Mm-hmm. We still feel vulnerable. We still feel that, even though, as you say, we have the power now, tomorrow that could all change. Look how many times we thought we were safe.
Yes, that's true, and I think that is, to some degree, in the marrow of the way many Jews see themselves, especially, frankly, older Jews. But I think that the point you were making is really a critically important one, which is to say that the reason that the American Jewish organizational establishment essentially reconstituted itself in the 1970s, because remember, the single defining issue of organized American Jewish life in the 1950s and 1960s was civil rights. That was the defining issue of the American organized establishment. I mean, the American Jewish Committee had more lawyers working on civil rights than did the NAACP or the Department of Justice at a certain point in the 1950s. It was the dominant issue in American Jewish life. It was the civil rights movement's success and the corresponding acceptance of Jews into American society by the 1970s that forced the American Jewish organizational establishment to figure out what these organizations were supposed to be doing. AIPAC was a very marginal organization into the 1970s, in large measure because Israel was not the dominant issue in American Jewish organizational life. I think the tragic mistake that organized American Jewry made was that in the 1970s, which was also the period that American Jewry began to become more and more worried about assimilation, right? American Jews had wanted assimilation. We want assimilation, and then all of a sudden, when assimilation came, people said, oh my goodness, our sons and daughters are marrying Gentiles. What's gone wrong here? It was actually I found this in my book, it was a sitcom in the early 70s that featured a Jewish cab driver married to a Catholic teacher, and the Jewish organizations campaigned to get it taken off of the air because they were so concerned about assimilation and about intermarriage. I think the problem, and this is what Abby is referring to, is that in the response, the right response to this fear of intermarriage, this fear of dwindling Jewish identity, would have been Jewish education. It would have been to say, how is it that we, the wealthiest Jewish community in the history of the world practically, are producing a generation of utterly ignorant Jewish children? And why should we possibly expect them to feel meaningfully committed to Judaism when we have not taught them very much about Judaism? I don't feel very connected to Australian rules football. And one of the big reasons is I don't know anything about Australian rules football. Why should the American Jewish community have thought that their children would feel particularly connected to Judaism when we have not created any meaningful system of Jewish education that actually works for our children? But I think in some ways, instead of confronting that more difficult problem, on really investing in Jewish education, which I really believe is the answer to producing Jewish commitment. The American Jewish community essentially, in large measure, decided to say that the way to keep young American Jewish kids Jewish was to say that they would be threatened by anti-Semitism. That you think that the world likes you, you think that the Gentiles are embracing you, but it's a ruse. They're really underneath, they still hate you as much as ever. That is not a meaningful basis, I believe, upon which to build Jewish identity. And it seems to me the fundamental problem that the American Jewish community has not effectively tackled, which other diaspora communities have done a much better job of. If you live in Australia, or in Canada, or in Mexico, or in Britain or France, or in South Africa, where my own family is from, you have the opportunity to send your children to an academically excellent, economically affordable Jewish school, which will get them into the best university in the country. In the United States, by contrast, the American Jewish organized community says the most important thing you can do is to inculcate commitment to Judaism amongst your children. But, by the way, if you want to contemplate a full-time Jewish education for your children, you're going to have to basically mortgage your house because it's going to be so expensive, and the schools are crumbling, and many of them don't know if they're going to be around in 3 years, and they have no gym, and they have no science lab. But go for it. It's the most important thing you can possibly do. And I think to some degree anti-Semitism has been used to fill the gap that should have been filled by Jewish education.
We're going to start collecting your questions, and I'm going to incorporate them with mine. So hopefully as quietly as possible, hand them to ushers. Just because you've raised Jewish education, I was going to get to it later, but I think it's interesting that you yourself have chosen to send your children to day school. And I just wondered if you could explain that calculation in the mix that we're in here.
Well, the joke may very well be on me because, as I sometimes tell my friends, for all of my left-wing political views, I often feel kind of sandwiched between an older generation in my family, which is much more politically conservative, and my own children, which partly as a result of the Jewish environment in which they're being raised, I often find are showing signs of being much more politically to the right than I am. So for instance, when we went to Israel earlier this summer, and I said to my son, we're going to Israel, where would you like to go? And he said, oh, I'd like to go to Mount Sinai. And so there was a kind of uncomfortable pause. And I said, well, here's the problem. We don't know where Mount Sinai is. First of all, they never tell us where Mount Sinai is. But the whole area, the Sinai, that was given by Israel to Egypt. And my son paused, and he gave me this look of utter horror, and he said, they gave it to Pharaoh? So we have our own impending challenges in this regard. Look, I'm not here to proselytize for sending kids to Jewish school. There are real downsides to sending your children to a Jewish-only environment. It became particularly clear to us because my wife and I thought, well, they're only interacting with Jews. This is not good. So why don't we enroll them in violin? Because everybody knows that in New York, those are all Asian kids, and they'll get a wider, experience. So, our kids, of course, were the worst in the class, but that was fine. Then after a few weeks, we thought, this is very nice, the families are so lovely, let's have them over for a Shabbat dinner. So we said to our kids, look, your friends are coming for Shabbat dinner, they may not know exactly everything you do in a Shabbat dinner, so would you please kind of help them out a little bit? And our daughter said, what do you mean, they know what to do? And I said, no, I don't. They really probably haven't been to so many Shabbat dinners. And she said, well, they're Jewish? And I said, no, they're really not Jewish. So this is the downside of sending your kids to Jewish school. My point is really not that everyone should make this choice. I think it's obviously very proud tradition of American Jews believing in public education. Everyone should do what is right for them. But what bothers me is that essentially you don't even really have the option for many families of an economically affordable, academically excellent school. Why should a family that really wants a full-time Jewish education have to sacrifice strong academic standards or literally have to go in financial distress if we say that this is something we really value. And I also happen to believe that there's another value of Jewish education which we don't always think about. And it's that Jewish education is not only important in being able to have a commitment to being Jewish, or at least being able to make an informed decision about what kind of Jewish life you want to live, because at least you have the building blocks to decide for yourself. It's also very important for engaging with Christian America. You know, in case you haven't noticed, we live in a very religious country. And I think that one of the things, frankly, that sometimes makes it harder for American Jews to understand the rest of America is that Christians often read the Bible a lot more than we do. They're often much more conversant with the texts that are also our founding texts than we are. And that if we were more conversant with those, we would have a common language, which would be useful, I think, in actually talking to other Americans outside of the Jewish community as well.
To pick up on that, I think this is an interesting question that's very basic, which is why do you think that it's important that young Jews maintain or obtain a Jewish identity?
Okay, so I guess I would say two things. Firstly, the thing that I care about most is that they be able to make an informed choice. I am not against intermarriage. It is hard enough in this life to find someone to fall in love with who you love. If you find love, you should go for it. The thing that bothers me is not that people make that decision. It's that the Jewish community has not given them even the knowledge base to know what they are giving up. If you make an informed decision, you've been given as a child some basis of understanding and appreciation, knowledge of joy in and fascination with Judaism. And then you decide, you know what? It's not for me. I think that's fine. What to me is a tragedy is when people give up something without ever having known what the inheritance that they actually had was. In terms of what I would say to my own children, I guess I would answer it this way. This may sound like a strange answer, but I believe that there is a lot that is wrong with American culture. I think that there is, and none of this is new to me, but this is a culture that I think is often wildly materialistic and individualistic and often soulless. And I think to live most successfully as an American, you need a countercultural experience. You need some form of identity or community which buffers you against essentially the kind of the ethic, the values that you see on TV and in the movies every night. And I think one of the most powerful ways of understanding Judaism is as a countercultural experience. The values and perspectives of Judaism and of Jewish community are, in America in 2012, I think, wildly countercultural. I mean, just take something as basic as honor your mother and father, or turn off your cell phone for one day a week because you actually have more important things to do than seeing what the last person posted on Facebook. I'm not suggesting that Judaism is the only source of countercultural values in America today. There are many others. But if you have that as your own inheritance, your own treasury passed down by tradition, I think you can find that it's actually very, very valuable in today's environment. It's very interesting to me to talk about this question of keeping Shabbat, because we are now a society in which it is, in many jobs, there is no legitimate excuse you can offer to your employer to spend a day with your family not working, except if you happen to be religious. And it seems to me that alone is a sign that there is something that is very wrong, and that there is something in the notion of Judaism that understands profoundly some of the dilemmas that people face today.
Two people wanted to know about the lack of an Israeli constitution. Can you address that in terms of your opinion? And how do you see at this stage a secular democratic constitution being developed?
Well, look, Israel couldn't develop a constitution because it couldn't basically deal with some very, very fundamental questions about the relationship between religion and state. It's funny because everybody talks about how important it is for Israel to remain a Jewish state. I want Israel to remain a Jewish state too, but the truth is Israel has never defined what it means for Israel to be a Jewish state. What is the essence of it being a Jewish state? Is it the law? Is it the right of return, that Jews get citizenship on day one? Is it the fact that Israel has a flag that has a Star of David on it and is shaped like a talus? Is it the fact that it has a national anthem which speaks of the Jewish soul? Is it the fact that that buses in public transportation in many parts of Israel shut down on the Sabbath? Nobody quite knows that. In fact, Israel doesn't even more primarily than that, Israel hasn't been able to do a great job of even defining what it means to be a Jew, let alone that itself is a massive can of worms. I think, and David Ben-Gurion and the founding generation of Israeli leaders essentially punted that question, because Ben-Gurion, in this kind of charmingly arrogant mid-century, 20th century secularist way, figured that the problem would solve itself because all of these ultra-Orthodox Jews were like a little museum to the past that would soon cease to exist, right? Because everybody knew that modern people weren't religious like that anymore, so you could have a few of them, but ultimately it would become a secular country. But the joke is on them, because soon 50% of the Jewish first graders in Jerusalem will be ultra-Orthodox. It's hard to imagine that Israel could actually define a constitution today that would be able to solve all those thorny problems. But what I think it has done, which is important, is that the Israeli Supreme Court has taken certain laws passed by the Knesset and said these are basic laws that give us the right to review Knesset legislation as potentially violating core principles of the Israeli state. And so that they have taken from those basic laws and from the principles in Israel's Declaration of Independence the right to be able to strike down legislation that they believe violates the ethos of the country. And I think that is a good basis upon which to build, but the truth of the matter is that regardless of what happens with the Palestinians in the West Bank, this question of how to, what defines Israel as a Jewish state and how to deal with the inherent tension between Israel as a state with a particular commitment to the Jewish people and Israel as a state that promises equality to all of its people, Jewish and non-Jewish, is going to bedevil Israel for many, many, many years to come.
A number of your critics have focused on the fact that your book seems to put the onus on thwarting peace on Israel more than on Palestine. And someone has a question, there is no chapter on the crisis in Palestine in your book. I do think it's somewhat fair that the critics say that what you are really seem to be focusing on is where in these talks and in these we came very close so many times, it was Israel who kind of threw a wrench in the works. Can you address the fact, do you actually believe that were it not for Israel, we would have an agreement by now?
Not necessarily. I actually don't think that's, I mean, you're right, critics have made that point. I don't think that's a fair reading of the book. I mean, I think that actually, I spend a lot of time talking about what I think happened in the Oslo peace process, then at the Camp David negotiations, then with the Clinton parameters offer in December of 2000. And I think at basically every step in that process, there were very substantial and major failures by both sides. I mean, I say that Yasser Arafat's, I'm very, very critical of Yasser Arafat for his very evasive response to the Clinton parameters in December 2000.